So why haven't people noticed this, right? If it's as circular as I say it is, why isn't that just obvious? Well, I think that's because of this distinction that you get, again, in early to mid-20th century philosophy of science between the context of discovery and the context of justification. And the way philosophers of science used to think about this was that, well, you can come up with a hypothesis just any old way, right? Hypothesis it's like an inspiration, right? So the famous example is Kekulé. He's the guy who figured out the structure of benzene. Benzene is a carbon molecule in the shape of a ring. And benzene, Kekulé, the story he told about his discovery, so he'd been thinking about benzene and thinking about benzene, going, what can its structure be? And one night he was asleep and he dreamt of a snake biting its tail. And he said, aha, it's a ring. Right? And you can go, and he tested it and confirmed it, and lo and behold, he was right. But it's what philosophers of science say. So discovery, we can't say anything about the logic of that. Discovery, pull it out of your ass, doesn't matter where it comes from, right? Justification, that's the epistemic engine of science, where you take your hypothesis and you rigorously test it. Now remember, our narrow evolutionary psychologists, they've been testing it, but the problem is they beg the question in the discovery situation. And we find this a little bit when we actually look at the way narrow evolutionary psychologists will characterize their own use of evolutionary thinking when they come up with hypotheses, right? So here's a little blurb from Toubion Cosmides, where they say, well, those other psychologists, the non-evolutionary psychologists, well, they come up with their hypotheses just any old way. We at least, we can use evolution in a valuable way. At least it's principled. We're not just coming up with any old hypothesis. And they go on to say even, at worst, our evolutionarily driven hypotheses is no more likely to be falsified. Of course, it's actually completely unlikely to be falsified. Of course it's not going to be falsified because the evolutionary hypothesis was based on looking at current behavior. They made the evolutionary hypothesis necessarily on the basis of current behavior. That's what Tinbergen tells us. It's the only thing you can do. They push it back into the evolutionary past, and then lo and behold, they rediscover it. It's highly unlikely that their hypotheses are ever going to be falsified. So it looks like an incredibly strong and powerful research program, because every hypothesis keeps on getting confirmed, right? So we have an explanation for why narrow evolutionary psychology is extremely empirically successful, right? It keeps on having its hypotheses confirmed, but we shouldn't be impressed by this success, right? Because it's reasoning in a circle, necessarily. Now, might there be more to explain why narrow evolutionary psychology is so resistant to criticism? This is one reason, but might there be more? And I'm going to have about 5 minutes left. Okay. Okay, now I have to warn you all that this is completely speculative, right? This is just me ruminating about what I think might be going on, but I don't really know what else to do when it comes to trying to figure out why, given all the problems with this research program, why is it still around, right? Why do people still take this seriously? So, because I've been working on thought experiments, that's the tools I have at hand, thinking about the way these hypotheses about the evolutionary environment get constructed is kind of like thought experimentation and how people imagine through thought experiments. With both thought experimentation and in the way you sort of come up with these evolutionary environments, you kind of imagine a scenario by fixing certain parameters and see what, once you've got those parameters fixed, what follows from them. And of course, the parameters we've got the Tinbergen parameters, efficient causation, ontogeny, and current survival value. And then we've got the parameters that neuroevolutionary psychologists just sort of stipulate as the way they theorize, right? So modular solutions to adaptive problems, universal human nature, also a dimorphic human nature, again, that weird thing that's going on, and the hunter-gatherer environment, right? Because you look at the hunter-gatherer idea and it's already gendered, right? It's already gendered because we know who's hunting and we know who's gathering. And so here are some of the ways we imagine our ancestors. Sorry, the light's not as good as I might have hoped, but you can see we've got some hunting going on here. Men, almost always men with spears, and big prey, more men with spears running after big prey. We've got a little family values narrative at the top, so you're sitting down for dinner, right? I don't know if it's mom and pop, kids and grandma, or it could be 2 females with 1 male, difficult to know. But you do tend to get these sort of family values pictured scenarios. Lots of fire in these pictures, tool making, nearly always spears, nearly always males, right? Now, some people have said, look, the way imagination works, certainly in thought experimentation, is you have this kind of chunked information, right? So when you're thinking about how you fill in the details to a scenario you're imagining, right? You don't think about every little detail one at a time. They sort of all come together, right? So you go, okay, I'm going to think, what about the adaptive problems that are associated with hunting, right? And what are all the bits of information that just sort of come along with thinking about hunting, right? Well, you have to ask yourselves, what do you imagine, right? What do you imagine when I say hunting, our Pleistocene ancestors hunting? Is there a gender stereotype that goes along with that? If there is, some other people have suggested that thinking of these in these chunked information terms, maybe the first time you try to imagine these evolutionary scenarios, it's kind of tough and you're trying to fill in the pieces. But soon it becomes easier because you keep on using the same scenarios over and over again. And they just seem to be more and more obvious. And the alternatives just seem to be more and more implausible, right? Because that's the way our sort of cognitive habits seem to work. Again, I know this is really speculative. Just to maybe try and disrupt some of the expectations I think you may have with hunting and tool use in hunting. Have any of you heard about chimpanzees seeming to use spears to hunt? Anyone? Okay. So what they do, first of all, we're not talking any kind of arrowheads here. Bite off the ends of sticks. And then they go to trees and they go spiking bush babies. Right? So you've got little bush babies that sleep in the sort of corner of trees. In the daytime, they're nocturnal animals. And the chimps go spiking the bush babies. So it's not this kind of big palaver of a whole bunch of guys getting together and chasing down the big beast. Right? They're poking bush babies. And it's females that do this. Because actually, the males do tend to get into big palavers and run around and hunt colobus monkeys and eat their brains, and of course the rest of them as well. But they don't use spears to do that, right? Now, if any of that seems surprising to you, right, then when you imagined hunting in our evolutionary history, the idea that maybe it's females going around with spears poking bush babies, if that never crossed your mind, right, then maybe that's showing how gender stereotypes are just kind of informing things without even knowing it. Because what the hell else are you going to do? Right? This again is sort of Tim Bergen's insight. You can only start thinking about the evolutionary past on the basis of what you observe at the present. You don't have an option, right? So it's not surprising if we use some of these stereotypes. Now I think I've run out of time, so I'm not going to talk about genealogy, which is the last thing I said I would talk about.